Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this segment of the Scholarly Skill into the archive, working with the primary sources. My name is Tokunbo Joe. I am the Associate Dean of Students here in Faculty of Grad Studies. I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of Communication and Media Studies. I shall be your host for this insightful scholarly skills session, which is highly demanded and requested by a number of our students to unpack the mystery of the archival research. I'm joined by Professor Leslie Korrick. Leslie, brief introduction of yourself.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. As some of you may know, I am an associate professor in the School of the Arts, Media, Performance, and Design here at York University, but I also have a number of graduate appointments, not just to art history and visual culture, but also to interdisciplinary studies and science and technology studies, for which I serve as the graduate program director. My research interests are very wide-ranging. They span chronologically and geographically several hundred years and at least three continents. And I'm really pleased to be here with Professor Ojo, Dr. Ojo, to talk about working in the archives. Some years ago, quite a number of years ago now, I was asked very last minute, I believe the last week of August, to teach a fourth year seminar in the Department of Visual Art and Art History called Art History and the Archives with S in parentheses, and I think that's important. And I was really taken aback. I thought, well, what could I put together in 1 week? What do I know about the archives? But in the course of that week, it became very clear to me that I had spent a good deal of my life working in archives on quite a wide range of subjects. And I might start off just by saying to you that if we begin very locally, I have done work in the Clara Thomas Archives and Special Collections, which I think some of you will know is part of Scott Library here at York. I've worked at the Archives of Ontario here on the York campus. I've moved out from there. I've worked at the Library and Archives of Canada. I've worked in various state archives in Italy, Rome, Florence, Venice. I've worked in the Fondation Le Corbusier in Paris, the Lincoln Center Archives in New York, and perhaps most interestingly, at least for me in my experience of archives, I've worked in the Vatican Secret Archives in the Vatican, which, as you know, is embedded in Rome. So it turns out that I've done a lot of research over a long period of time in archives, and I've also been thinking about archives both in terms of a kind of theoretical construct, a topic for a course. And I've been thinking about it as well in terms of my interests in around systems of knowledge. I'm very interested, broadly speaking, and perhaps this is what ties a lot of my disparate work together. I'm interested, broadly speaking, in systems of knowledge that have been put into place both within academia and outside of that, and then the different ways in which we might come to reconfigure those that in ways that make more sense for us today. So I'm really glad in the end that Dr. Ojo invited me to join you, and I think we're going to have a conversation between us about matters to do with the archives and possibly the archive singular as well. And we'll be very happy as we're talking or after we're finished talking to entertain your questions and comments. So I'll turn the floor back over to Dr. Ojo and see where he leads me.
Oh, I have so many questions, and this is supposed to be dialogue and conversation. So, knowing fully a number of our grad students engage in the research that they with the primary resources, and knowing fully many of them intend to work with the archive, and some of them are working with the archive. So, let's go to the very basic. What does it mean to actually work in the archive?
That's a big question. Let's see what we can do with that. One thing I will say right off the top is that for many people who are perhaps not so much in the know or haven't had that firsthand experience, there's often this conflation of libraries with archives. But I think they are, in some ways, very different beasts. And I think part of what makes the archives different from a library has to do with both the kind of material that you find in an archives and also the way that your experience of that material unfolds. So let me say, just by way of introduction, in an archives, more often than not, the material is unpublished. That's not to say there's never any published material there, but archives are very often guardians of, and I use that word quite deliberately, at least as a starting point, of unique materials. And more often than not, unique materials that have been donated to the institution for safekeeping or for protection or for circulation. And they come to the archives in some senses pre-organized, but that matter of organization is perhaps a little bit different than what you would find in a library, because in a library you have a call number system based on subject. That call number system might be the Library of Congress. It might be the Dewey Decimal System, which of course is something you find more often in a public library as opposed to an academic library. But in the archives, there's some sense that the material has come not unorganized, but organized more personally. It might be due to the fact that the donator has organized the materials a particular way. The donator might be somebody different from the subject of the material itself, because often material is organized by individual, biographical things that we don't pay so much attention to anymore. But I think when you're going into an archives, you want to be thinking about provenance a little bit, like where did the material come from? Who specifically donated it, and then to what extent is it organized? And if it is organized at all, what are the personal elements that make that organizational system unique? And often that really depends on what is in the particular grouping of material that's being donated. The word you want to keep in mind, if you're not already familiar with this, is fonds, Fonds. It's a word to describe what we might otherwise call a collection or a body of materials. But in the archives, we don't really talk about collection because that carries with it certain kinds of implications that are not necessarily so appropriate in this case. So when you go to an archives and you're going to begin a project or begin some research to support a project that's already underway, you're walking into a space that has its own characteristics from fond to fond, and may require of you different ways of proceeding, depending what's being held. I think we often think that in an archives, we're largely talking about text-based material, and
Mhm.
that probably is true to some extent. But I do think we have to also keep in mind that we may also be considering images, photographs, sound recordings. Often we'll find interviews, audio interviews, and so on, moving images, and even objects, right? And so there is a range of material, but I think much of what we understand to be archival research is very much grounded in text, and maybe that's where we're going to start. If we're talking about archives with an S on the end of it, I think we're also talking about a physical location. And I named a good number of physical locations when I started in terms of where I've worked. We're also referring to the physical material that's held within that physical location. But I think right off the top, we also want to note that archives now exist online in many cases, and not just as duplication of material that you might find in an archives that you can otherwise visit and call out items firsthand, but also in and of themselves. Like there's a politics around the archives. And we can talk more about this as we go forward. But I will say what's interesting to me about online archives that are not simply duplications of material already being held physically in some kind of architectural structure is that there's a sense that maybe online archives can speak to that which is missing in a traditional archives, right? And the notion of the online archive over time has become very tied up with exposing voices that aren't always heard in particular archives, creating links, building community around archives that have some link to immigration, migration, the ravages of war, all of these things. So, depending on what kind of topic you're taking on and what your interests are, you might in fact find that an online archives or a series of online archives are more to the point for you than these traditional archival structures that combine architecture and then holdings, the fond, various fond within them. But I think based on what Dr. Ojo and I talked about when he first asked me to participate, we were going to go first and foremost into the physical structure with its holdings. Am I right about that?
Yes, you're right about that. And one thing that I will also add, give it a further to mention what topic you are working on. Traditionally, when we all started, as a PhD student, we have research question and we are going in to look for the answer. Now, when you situate this in the context of doing the archival research and the unpredictable nature of knowledge, wealth of collection, how do you balance that focused research question with the mystery and the fun part of unknown discovery that you might find in the archive?
That's a good question. And I am interested in your use of the word mystery as you asked it of me, because I think a lot, unlike libraries, which seem very accessible to us, um, the archives does carry this kind of cast of mystery. And I do think I mentioned the Vatican secret archives. I didn't insert that word secret. That's what they're called, the Vatican secret archives. This notion of hidden knowledge that might be uncovered. Having worked in archives for a long time, let me tell you this. Once you learn the system of whatever archive you're in, there's no mystery involved. I mean, the mystery might be in finding the answer to your research question, but I think most archives have a set of protocols, a set of procedures that they want each researcher to follow as they come in. And once you get the hang of that, um, it's not so much different than rifling through a series of library books or other forms. Um, and yet there are some differences which we will continue to talk about. But I do think when you go into the archives, and this picks up on what Dr. Ojo was saying, um, while it's not unlike other kinds of research you might do, there is another layer of detective work involved, right? Because you're not confronting a system of call numbers that A, you're familiar with, and B, are very much structured in terms of subject and then subdivided again by subsections of that subject. So there's a little bit more of a, what should I say, journey to finding material in an archives as opposed to in a library. The other thing I will just say about that detective work or the thrill of the chase as you're trying to get to something that may or may not be useful to you, is the matter of erotics. This might sound slightly odd to you, but if you're working in an archives with largely unique material, some of which may not have been touched for a very long time, if at all, since it entered into the archives. There's something kind of fabulous about about holding something in your hand, turning a page, or smelling the object. There's something very physical, very sensorial about that. I call that the erotics of working in an archive, which I think is quite distinctive relative to working in a library. And I will just anecdotally and briefly say that maybe about 20 years ago, the graduate program in music invited three of us who were working in music at that time to come and talk a little bit about our experiences in the archives. And we were each invited to bring one object, archive related, to the table. And afterwards, in the question period, a number of students mentioned that all three of us were hanging on to our object and massaging our objects or clutching to our bodies our objects. And we were all taken aback. But after that, I really got thinking about that matter of being able to engage physically with something unique and what it might have to say about the process of research, yes, but even sometimes about the material you need to answer a question. And let me just jump ahead a little bit here and say that this is a good argument for visiting archives, even when some of the material has been reproduced online, because digitization allows for these otherwise mysterious and not so easily accessible objects to circulate more widely, but it also eliminates certain details that might be useful to you or even more than useful, important to you. Notes made in the margin by another hand, if we're thinking about earlier kinds of texts and the way that researchers or readers more generally would have engaged with them. So that kind of thing gets lost. If you're looking at a particular document or even a book, whether manuscript or published, because there is some published material in archives, what part of that book was most interesting to the person who originally held it, or to people of an earlier period? You have to be able to see which pages have been thumbed more, this kind of thing. These really sort of beautiful details are not available when you're working with online reproductions. I'm a real fan of the Internet Archive, I have to say. But even those facsimiles there are not picking up the kind of detail that you might actually find very revealing in your research. But I suppose maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit and we go ahead.
I have another question relating to that. Because when we're thinking about the politics of the archive and the archival work, so there are a number of questions that always come in as critical scholars. How do you actually deal with the question of access, privilege that actually shape the archival work? Because on one end, you've worked in different geographical space. That also define what you have access to, what privilege and what you don't have access to. So how have you, from your experience, navigated all those challenges and still be able to get the work done?
Yes, well, that would go to your comment you made to me last week about the do's and don'ts of archival research, I think, to some good extent. And, often when you're going to the archives, you're traveling, right? You're leaving your home base, and you have to be very efficient about getting that access. and overcoming a kind of hierarchical system that may not be particularly friendly to you. So let me see if I can just walk very pragmatically through a few things here, okay? So, first of all, before you go to an archives, you want to find out what is required for entry, like in advance, before you ever leave home. This may seem obvious, but different archives require different kinds of documents. Um, if you're if you're going overseas, for example, they might even want to hang on to your passport. They may ask you for a letter from your institution or from your supervisor at least. And you want to have all of this nitty-gritty out of the way because you don't want to show up at an archives, even if it's closer by, and not have the right paperwork to enter into that space, that privileged space, as you rightly called it, for better or worse. I think the other thing that you want to do well in advance is to really find out about the culture of the archives you're planning to work in. Um, this may sound crazy, but each archives has its own particular culture. What are the opening hours? What days are they open? Are there periods in the year when they're entirely closed? Is there a check-in system? What hoops do you have to jump through to get your access pass, your reader's card? Um, Once you're in, what is the procedure for ordering material? Some archives will let you order reams and reams of fonds without any kind of limitation. Others will only allow you a certain number of items per day. What is their attitude about handling materials? Some archives require you to wear gloves for certain kinds of material. More archives than not today say, after long experience with the gloves, they figure that people are stumbling. They're not very agile when they've got these cotton gloves on, and so cotton gloves aren't needed after all. But for example, if you go to the archives of Ontario, if you're handling photographs, they want you to have those gloves on, no matter the damage you might do through the handling. So, is this a place where you need to wear gloves or have some other kind of relationship with the objects? What is the procedure for calling out material and hanging on to it for days at a time? Some archives require you to sit in very specific places depending on what kind of material you're using. What are the rules for reproduction? Can you be snapping away on your smartphone, or do you have to go through a different kind of procedure that is not only about handling materials, but also about copyright rules and so on? Do you need to know that kind of thing in advance as well? Who owns the archives? Are they public archives? Are they private archives? Some archives are run like a civil service. Others give you more direct contact with archivists. But it's really good to get these rather mundane but very important details under your belt and dealt with as much as you can in advance so that when you arrive, your access is that much easier. I'll go back to the Vatican secret archives just to illuminate this for you a little bit because those archives are in the Vatican and the Vatican is in Rome and considers itself a separate city. You need a passport to get into the main gates. Um, Within that secret archives, there's a hierarchy. There are scholars there from all over the world. Where you are from places you in the hierarchy. What languages can you speak? Can you communicate with those who are collecting your material? What's your gender? What's your age? What are you wearing? I'm not exactly I don't know who to mention, but let's say I've been over the years been sent home from the Vatican secret archives 3 times because my clothing was too revealing. So, I'm taking the extreme example here, but all of these small details that you wouldn't necessarily think are important not only to make your time there run more smoothly, but also to make sure that the institution is taking you more seriously as a scholar and is more therefore inclined to help you get to the material that you want to get to, especially when it's not so obvious. So that's something of the legwork you want to keep in mind before you ever actually get down to the nitty-gritty of your research. I will say though, that in terms of getting to the research yourself in an archives, because you're not just going to an online catalog to look things up, you need to have given yourself some sense of what you're looking for before you get there. And the fact that you've chosen this archives or that archives to visit means you have some sense already of what is being held. How do you get to that sense of what is being held in the archives? One thing you can do is when you're reading material in and around your topic, try to look at what the scholar you're reading has cited as potential source of material, archival material. You can often find references in footnotes or endnotes to the sort of thing that the scholar you're reading has already looked at in an archives. Don't blow it off and think that that scholar has already done the work for you, because that scholar's agenda and research question could be quite different from yours. You're using what that scholar has referenced to think about whether there are other things that you could reference out of that same material for your own purposes. So that's one way of trying to get a handle on how to begin, because footnotes and endnotes will give you the generally will give you the very specific details that you need to know in order to cite that material, right? Again, it's not using a card catalog, it's not using the Library of Congress system. So you have to start getting used to names of donors or names of collectors or names of individuals associated with the material in a particular font as a way of getting to that material. The other thing, and this is really important now, if you've done that first step, is to look in advance to see if your archives have what are called finding aids. Archives don't have catalogs, as I've now said several times over, but they do often have finding aids, which means for a given collection, they've done a kind of outline. Oh, I shouldn't say collection, I should have said fond there. Let me correct myself. Um, or as these fonds come in, and as they are evaluated as having perhaps more likelihood of usage by researchers, they create what is called a finding aid. I think this is the most important thing. If what you're interested in has a finding aid, you can go through and look at the subdivisions of what's in that particular font. For example, maybe there's a whole section on correspondence. Within that, letters to person X, letters to person Y, and so on. Maybe there's a section on well, it all depends what the topic is, but things that have to do with the somebody's life or somebody's work around a particular topic. So please always look for a finding aid. This can save you tons of time, especially if you do it before you arrive. At the same time, I would add a caveat to that. If you use those, don't rely on them entirely. They represent one archivist's view at one particular moment in time, right? And our interests in subjects and how we use the material associated with those subjects changes over time. And a finding aid from 1940 may not be all that useful to you in 2025. At the same time, you can look at those finding aids as historical documents, and that too can have some kind of impact on your research potentially. What I think might be coming out of what I'm saying here is this, that while there are ways of getting at the material or thinking about the material you might want to look at it in advance, archival research is a slow process and often requires you to spend extensive time going through material that you don't think in the first instance has any bearing on your project. There's a kind of level, there's the potential for a level of frustration. I'll say the potential for a
Mhm.
level of frustration in archival work that doesn't exist in other kind of research. And you shouldn't be frustrated by that. And you shouldn't think to yourself, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a loser. Nothing's happening for me. You have to be patient and you have to wait for the material to emerge and perhaps speak to you. If you're in an archives, where you're only allowed a limited number of things per day or per week, as is the case in some archives. Here's a piece of advice. The only good piece of advice I ever got from a professor when I was a PhD student going off for the first time to do archival research. I was going to a place where you could only call out three things a day. And this professor said to me, call out one item you absolutely know you want to work with. Therefore, if everything else is a bust that day, you have something that can fill up your time and you're not going to have to leave in an hour and that day is wasted. He said the second thing you should call out is an item that perhaps you're not 100% sure is useful to you, but you have a good hunch that it will be useful, or perhaps it's tied to the first thing that you've called out that you know will be 100% useful. And then he said to me, and I really underline this, he said, the third thing you choose should be something that you're going out on a limb for. Maybe you have a hunch, maybe it's just serendipity, maybe it's the result of your creativity in terms of your research method or your thinking. It's the thing you take a chance on. And maybe 9 times out of 10, there's nothing in it that you want. But then there's going to be this moment where you hit something that you absolutely do want. And what's more, could never have found otherwise if you hadn't taken that chance. And I really think that that's a very underestimated piece or strategy for archival research. Always be taking a chance to look at things that aren't on a finding aid, that haven't been cited elsewhere, etc. Can I say a bit more? Or
Yes, say
you
a
want,
bit more, but I also want to add another question before because I want to leave the last 10 minutes so that we can
yes.
take question live.
Okay.
We've talked a lot about official archive in quotation. What happened to unofficial archive? Say, Tokunbo passed away tomorrow and he left all his handwriting or work in his family collection. And somebody's curious to know what kind of forensic AD Tokunbo was in his lifetime and decided to go in. How do you work with those unofficial family collection, individual collection, and what does that mean in terms of challenges also translating those to the academic work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I've done some of this work where I've tried to work with family archives. In fact, I'm trying to do that right now. And it's a little bit different in that you're working not with an institution or archivists within the institution, but people for whom this stuff is so close to their hearts, right? And you need to be um, that much more careful about respecting their family history and how they see things. If they allow you to go through their materials or whatever they've collected, you're going to do what you will with it. And you will do that because, in that case, you've probably had to go through an ethics procedure that everybody on both sides has signed off on. And thus, you have the right, given that they've signed off on it, to do what you will with what you find. But you have to be very careful when you're going through the material often with those individuals looking over your shoulder or wanting to
Mhm.
discuss with you each thing that you uncover, that you keep your opinions, let's say, that might potentially move them away from being assistive to yourself, right? And you I think also you need to, when you're using that material as you're writing, if that's what you're doing with your research, to be very careful about thanks. We often thank other professors and we often thank institutions in acknowledgments of books or in footnotes in articles. But this, I think, is a slightly different situation where somebody's done something for you on a personal level and you have to acknowledge that in a different way. But at the end of the day, to me, you have to be true to your thoughts
Mhm.
that emerge out of that material, right? You're not writing whatever you're writing for the holder of that private collection or that private fond any longer. You and it takes a little bit of strength, I think, to be able to find find your own way to making the case you want to make while being grateful for whatever you've been able to access. I don't know if you want to add something to that, Tokunbo.
Well, I mean, these days, a number of our students want to do work on autoethnography, and sometimes they require working with the family connection and how you translate that back into the public scholarship. And that sometimes creates question around privacy and the public knowledge. And as somebody that work on the media industry, history, looking at the ownership, a number of time I have to depend on memoir. I have to depend on personal notes, exchange between, different board of directors member. But some of those are difficult to also translate into public scholarship without not breaking that private code because depending on the degree of access, how you got those material and what you are doing with them largely. So it's create that tension, but broadly, because one thing that I find with this conversation is extremely rich. And I think we need to do part two of this down the line because there are different aspects to dealing with archival work. Yes, we spend a lot of time on the official one, the institution, but the family collection, public history, even though talking about digital archive also open up range of challenges and different skills that might be required because depending on what we are looking at broadly. So largely, I think on the personal level, working with family connection, no collection and the material, presenting all new challenges and new lens because how you document the memory and how you also engage the kind of question that you are asking around those material.
Yeah, and I would also add something here that I think applies equally or almost equally to working with personal or family archives versus institutional archives. And that is no matter which one of these types of archives you find yourself in, don't for a second think that you're in a neutral space,
Mhm.
right? And as I underlined, this goes across the public and the private, the family and the institutional. Um, Sometimes archivists or institutions will tell you that it's neutral because they've accepted something from a donor, it's pre-organized by the donor, and they're very careful not to fuss too much with that organization because the organization itself reflects something about the history of those materials. But you know, even the mere fact that something is collected by an institution or the mere fact that a family has decided this is important enough to keep is a decision that in itself is not neutral, right? So And we might even say that there's no neutrality working in a library, books have their points of view and so on. But I do think in archival work, this matter of neutrality not, becomes more acute. And in conjunction with that, you want to be thinking about whose voices are represented
Mhm,
and whose are not. Like, do not underestimate what is missing in the archives. And this is something, again, we might talk about first institutionally, but I think even in private archives, you don't know if you're being presented with all that is there, right?
mhm,
You don't know if somebody has done a little censorship project before they've invited you to come and look at the material and so on. So you want to be looking really hard or engaging really hard with the materials that are in the archives, but you want to have that antenna up for what is not there because always an interesting story to be told around what is missing. The the absence of material is also what shall we say, informative as well. It's informational as well. I had a really interesting experience just a couple of weeks ago. I went to London in the UK to give a paper at a conference. And I was at a place called the Warburg Institute, which you may or may not know about. It's associated with the University of London. And it was established after the Second World War to look at the role of images in culture, cross-disciplinary, global. And they had an exhibition on while I was there called Black Atlas.
mhm,
And it was about all of these images globally of the Black collected over time and put into this archives. But this was the very first moment when somebody, a Black artist, actually went into those archives and uncovered that stuff. Like nobody even knew that stuff was there, right? So missing has a number of definitions attached to it. It may be that nothing is there, or it may be that something is there, but nobody has found it, or nobody cared to give it a second glance because it was deemed in that moment irrelevant, right? And so this is where I think this intensification of searching becomes really interesting in the archives.
mhm,
And can really explode your project if you're lucky enough to reach that moment where you have, I guess it's the aha moment where you really stumble on something and you say, oh, what the F, right? Because it's that dramatic and that shocking and that
mhm,
revelatory all at the same time. And these things we're talking about now will guide how you proceed in the archives, but it's also at the heart of the notion of the archive singular, right? That the archive itself is a subject of study, a subject of research, and it has all of these problems around it. Over to you, Dr. Ojo, because I think
Before we take the
we have questions.
question, so just two major things that I want to underscore. Number one, to do this kind of work require curiosity. To
Yeah.
do this kind of work require patience. To do this kind of work also require being open-minded. Don't presume that everything you find is the answer because the
Yes.
politics of what is included and excluded is key. Also, where those materials are placed. So many years ago, about 7 years ago, I was in Finland and I was looking for something completely different in the archive there. And I quickly realized that I stumbled on some official government document that I could not find in the official collection or private archive in the nation state of Nigeria. And I was taken aback because these actually reveal a lot. So the question that came to mind, how did they get to Finland? Why are they in that archive, not in the country of origin? And what purpose are they serving there? So those kind of questions further will lead you to further dig further. Like, okay, they are there, but what else is missing? And why are they placed there? More so, the other layers of untangling that to the bigger question relating to the collection itself, message embedded in those material, in terms of the written aspect of it, and in terms of the quality of the material that has been placed there also.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think it goes along with this um, matter of, going with a research question and expecting to find the answers to your question and needing to be able to let go and work with the answers that don't answer your research question or the material that doesn't answer your research question, that maybe pushes you in another direction, or at the extreme end of that, has completely undermined your research question to the point where you have to go back to square one again, right? And sometimes that comes out of the font itself, and sometimes that comes out of the very things that Dr. Ojo is saying, when you really think about not just the material contained in the font, but the trajectory of the font itself, right? The history of the font itself, the I would say even the biography of the font itself, right? Which has its own agency to some extent, no matter what hands have been laid on it over time, huh?
Well, this is rich, and I want us to continue, but let's give our audience and guests, the opportunity to ask questions live. So,
For sure.
Alexa.
Thank you so much. We have so many people just saying thank you. We need another session on this. This is a lot. We have more questions. So I'm sure there's a part two to come. So the first question is a follow-up to fonts, and I'm just going to read it out aloud. What determines whether fonts become a part of an archive versus a part of a museum?
Is that for me?
Yes.
I think
Okay.
so.
Um, I think so much is in the hands of the archivist or a group of archivists associated with an institution. And so much is in the hands of whoever's donating the material or otherwise passing on the material. Right? Often it's just whoever is holding that material who makes a decision about whether to approach an archives or to approach a museum or a gallery, because museums and galleries do have their own archives. And I mean, maybe the easy way of answering that is to say if it has something to do with art, or like, I guess it depends on what kind of museum we're talking about, right? Because a museum could be a science museum, or it could be a natural history museum. Let's just say if you're holding something that has relevance to the holdings of a museum, it's often the person who's holding it who makes the decision about whether to go and approach an archives or to go and approach a museum. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that even if you think the font are neutral, this decision about whether something's going to come into the archives or not in the first place is both fraught and subjective, right? And so sometimes somebody will propose to give something to an archives, a font to an archives, and the archives will say no. And then they'll turn perhaps to a museum, perhaps to some other kind of institution if they don't want to keep it themselves. So those I think are two important details. But I think at the same time, even if they're important details, they're details that are very much open to chance, right? And I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about whether it goes into an archives or whether it goes into a museum. Although I will say this, that some archives, and for that matter, some museums, will restrict the kinds of things they'll take. I know recently, because I've been working on a project that has physical objects, there was a lot of talk about whether those physical objects is the wrong word. Let me go back. Three-dimensional objects. They're not books, they're not papers, they're not photographs, they're not flat items. there was a lot of debate about whether or not they could go into the Clara Thomas archives and special collections because they don't generally collect three-dimensional forms, and especially not large three-dimensional forms. So sometimes it's just the shape, the size, the character, the physical character of the material in the font that determines where it can go. So that would be another thing I would take into account. And I think Dr. Ojo wants to add to that.
No, no, you've covered no a lot of that, Grant. So in the interest of time, we'll move on to the second question. So, but I'm really enjoying this, and you are really enriching my depth because I didn't know what I was getting to when I invited you, but now I'm blown away.
Thank
So
you.
who's next? Who's got a
Thank you.
question there?
This question is for both of you. So, what are your thoughts on using archives for researching for popular history or general interest? So, examples, newspaper articles about local heritage buildings. That is as opposed to answering a specific research question.
Um, I have a thought on that, but I'll go second since I was
Okay.
hogging the floor.
Well, you were not. So when it comes to newspaper present different form of challenges depending on the time period, depending on what you are looking at. Because one of the things you always have to keep in mind when it comes to the newspaper, yes, they record history, but that history is also non-neutral because the process of producing news article goes through selection and exclusion of certain thought. So generally, when you are working with newspaper or the media material, you need to sort of know the time, space, and the politics around those newspapers. So in terms of the ownership, it's quite important. You also need to also know one or two things about the history and the particular ways in which the stories were covered at that point in time. So for instance, one of the work that I've been doing relating back, looking at the history of the black newspapers. And when I put in the context of the period in which many of those black newspapers existed in Canada and United States, they were set up as the counter-hegemony discourse to the mainstream media, and they project the history and the culture of the black community. So on one end, when I look through those content, they provide certain view of the community. But now when I contrast those to the mainstream media around that same time period, I have a different kind of collection. So broadly, when you're walking through newspapers, the archive, do not restrict yourself to one set of newspapers. Look broadly and understanding the ownership, the history, and the role they set out to play in that particular period in time. So that help you in also critically examine what you are getting out of those newspaper content.
I think also um, I'll add the following. In answer to your question, in my first answer to your question about using archives for popular history, for the vernacular, and for the amateur historian, let's say, absolutely 100%. I think that's a great way to go. I don't think there should be any restriction on that. And actually, archivists are very, oh, well, in many institutions, not all, not the secret archives of the Vatican, for example, but archives of Ontario or Clara Thomas or an art gallery, they're very open to having amateurs, and I mean this in the best sense of the word amateur historians or amateurs with interest come in and use those archives. I don't see any reason why they shouldn't, especially because a lot of that material is in publicly funded archives. It's paid for by your tax dollars, so you should be able to get in there and use that material. But even for somebody like me, I recently did a project on the first adventure playground in Toronto, and possibly even in Canada, but it doesn't exist and it had been lost to history. And the only way I was able to reconstruct that was through going to archives and looking at newspapers, taking into account all of the things that Dr. Ojo just said about, contextualizing the paper, understanding the editorial stance, and so on. But it was a local newspaper. Um, not, well, in the end, I did use the Globe and Mail, the Telegram, and the Star, and all these other papers. But the richness was in a local paper intended for locals of the day to read. I also found material in the papers of a York professor, now dead. She donated her papers to that Clara Thomas archives. Unbelievably, found stuff in there. Found a few things in my parents' basement. Not that that's an archives, but again, I'm just saying, even as a bona fide researcher, you don't have to be an amateur historian to take on popular history, right? You can take on any kind of question you want, popular history included. So there you go. That's my answer. And I think there's another question we're to attend to now.
Yeah, just one more question directed at you. Very enlightening and empowering dialogue. My question is, thinking of the time when you were a young scholar, how did you overcome the sociological barriers, the trepidation of critically engaging with archival research that can be important to our research, but what we know is going to be a steep learning curve to navigate and comprehend this foreign process?
Hmm. Do you want to go first on that one?
Well, like I said, patient curiosity makes a whole big difference. So, no matter what, yes, there will be fear of unknown, but that's why we ask deeper question. And this is also one of the things that we take in when we are digging in. And one of the things that I want to also leave you guys with is this: when you walk into any archive, there are people there that you can ask questions on what collection they have and what kind of material that are available. And one of the things with the psychological aspect of it is this: we all have imposter syndrome because sometimes you discover something big, you're like, no, I'm overthinking this. There is no process of overthinking. There is actually that process of you asking the next question and digging deeper. So embrace the finding, but also be open minded that you are not going in, I'm looking for A, I need to find A. In the process of going to the archive to find A, you might find A, B, C, D, which actually open up perspective for you and also making you to come out with a rich finding. Professor Carlin.
So So I think also you were talking about the sociological
Mhm.
side of this, and I have to say that when I was a young scholar, I can barely remember, but thinking back on it now, and I tried to address this a little bit in some of my earlier comments. Um, you know, working in the Vatican secret archives, it was a minefield because I was young, because I was female. In that archives, you sit in a reading room looking at your material with a priest on a raised dais sitting at a desk watching you like a hawk. Here I am, an atheist female, um, somebody who could read Italian and Latin, which was the material I was looking at perfectly, but had to get up at 5 every morning and like try and construct sentences to ask in Italian for what I wanted. You know what? I'll tell you what helped me most of all to get across those sociological barriers, besides being open-minded, besides being curious, as Professor Ojo has said, was just like a kind of thick forehead. Right? What I mean by that was just like bouncing back every time I hit a brick wall. That's not actually very helpful if you're somebody who feels you're being discriminated against or we're still entirely invisible. But you have to have a certain kind of fearlessness and bounce backableness um, when you're thinking about trying to negotiate archival work in sociological terms. Like you can't change yourself. So what is it? What kinds of temperaments or temperamental dimensions can you bring to the table when you hit the brick wall, which you will do lots of times?
Thank you so much. This was such an incredible topic. Um, Dr. Odra, I don't know if you wanted to say anything before I just wrap up and tell folks about the next sessions. Go for it.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Professor Leslie Korrick for actually helping to navigate the mystery and the complexity of archival research and for sharing years of knowledge with all of us. Likewise, I also want to say thank you to you, Anessa, Debbie, for putting this together behind the scene and for everyone that have showed up to participate in this. We really appreciate your time for joining us. So thank you, every one of you.